hopefully you all can see. Alrighty. Hi, my name is Melody Phillips, and I am here to talk to you all about communicating with the visually impaired. Throughout this semester, my classmates and I have learned about various forms of communication and how it affects our lives. As some of you know, my mother was blind, and she raised me completely by herself. She was blind my entire life. So since living with her in a house with someone who was solely, since living in the house solely with her, I didn't realize that my upbringing was different compared to others. It wasn't until I was an adult that I realized that things were different in my household. One of the biggest differences that I evaluated was communication. I evaluated the way that I communicated with my mother, and I also evaluated the way that others communicated with my mother, or in some cases did not. I've found that a lot of people have trouble communicating with the visually impaired. They find it difficult. It's not, they don't try to, it's just they don't understand them, so they don't know where they're coming from. So when communicating with someone who is visually impaired, one must remember that most of the communication rules stay the same, and that we should communicate with them as someone with someone who has their sight. Today I would like to discuss with you all on how to communicate effectively, comfortably, and then naturally with the visually impaired. While doing research for this topic, I came across a nonprofit organization called Vision Australia. They provide services for the blind. On their site, they compiled a list of how to communicate effectively with someone who is blind, and I would like to share a couple with you. Number one is speak naturally and clearly. Do not talk slower so that they can understand you, and do not yell at them so that they can hear you better. People would do this to my mother, and she would always say, "I'm blind, not deaf." Number two is never channel a conversation through a third person. Speak directly who you're talking to. And this is why I chose this video, because it was something that always bothered me the most when I would go to the doctor with my mother, and the doctor would always speak to me and just pretend like she wasn't even in the room. And it was kind of rude, and it bothered me, but when I got older, I realized that they weren't being rude intentionally. They were just, they didn't understand where she was coming from. So if you ever come in contact with someone who is visually impaired, you should start with speaking effectively so that the person you are talking to will feel comfortably. This brings me to my next topic, speaking comfortably. The American Foundation for the Blind has a list of ways to communicate comfortably. Communicating comfortably is essentially the same as communicating effectively. However, to me, is a bit more personal and takes time. I also chose two on their list that I would like to share. Number one is be an active listener. Give the person opportunities to talk. Respond with questions and comments to keep the conversation going. A person who is visually impaired can't necessarily see the look of interest on your face, so you have to give verbal cues to let him or know that you are actively listening. The sighted must understand that the blind lack some forms of nonverbal communication, and it can affect a conversation more than some of us may realize. And number two is always answer questions and be specific or descriptive in your responses. This is my favorite point because it's so important. My uncle was the best at describing things to my mother, and he was very happy to do it. If they were driving down the street and they were passing a field, he'd say, "Oh, there's beautiful red flowers," or "There's a big tall tree," just things like that. And I, on the other hand, I would always pout when she asked me to describe things, because I feel like she always asked me to describe boring things, like what's on the shelves at the grocery store, things like that. However, I am grateful for that task now, because I feel like that's why I'm more descriptive when I tell stories and when I write papers. When you begin communicating comfortably with someone who is blind, things start to flow naturally, and it's no different than talking to someone who is sighted. And this brings me to my last point. So Many of you may wonder what I say when I say flow naturally. What I mean is you fall into a natural conversation and you break the habit of choosing your words carefully when you're speaking to someone visually impaired. For example, I would ask my mom, "Where are the scissors?" or "Did you see them?" And friends would be over and they'd say, "Why did you ask your mom, did she see the scissors?" And then I had another friend, I was talking about my mom watching court shows, and he was like, "She's blind. How does she watch TV?" And I never really had answers for those questions, but I can say that when I was looking for the scissors, she was able to show me where they were every time, and she did watch TV every day. So just watch what you say and don't offend them by changing your vocabulary, because they do get it, and it hurts their feelings. I found a site with Vision Loss Guide, and on it states, when you meet someone who is blind or visually impaired, be yourself, use common sense, and just let the rest happen. In conclusion, I would like to say that we all have our differences, and there can be so many barriers when it comes to communication, whether the barrier may be someone who is deaf, blind, or just someone who doesn't even speak English. We have to learn how to break down these barriers and learn how to communicate effectively, comfortably, and then naturally. Thank you all for your time.